Sarah Martinez had never imagined that her Tuesday evening self-defense class would prepare her for a real-life encounter just 3 weeks later. The community center gymnasium smelled of rubber mats and determination as 20 women gathered twice weekly to learn basic protection techniques from instructor Mike Chen, a former military police officer who believed every woman deserved to feel safe walking home alone. The October air carried an unusual chill as Sarah left her marketing job at the downtown advertising agency where she had worked for the past 4 years. Her routine had become predictable: catch the 6:15 bus, transfer at Main Street, walk the final 8 blocks to her apartment in the Riverside district. The neighborhood had been gentrifying slowly, with new coffee shops and bookstores replacing old laundromats and corner markets, but pockets of the area still felt uncertain after dark. Sarah carried her laptop bag and purse while mentally reviewing the presentation she needed to finish for tomorrow's client meeting. The streetlights flickered inconsistently along Maple Avenue, casting long shadows between the old oak trees that lined the sidewalk. She had walked this route hundreds of times before, usually feeling confident and alert, but tonight something felt different. 3 blocks from her apartment, Sarah noticed a figure sitting on the steps of an abandoned storefront that had once housed a small grocery store. The building had been empty for months, with plywood covering the windows and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. The person appeared to be a young man, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He looked up as she approached, making direct eye contact that lasted longer than felt comfortable. "Evening, miss," he said, standing up slowly. His voice carried a strange mix of politeness and something else Sarah couldn't identify. "Nice night for a walk." Sarah nodded politely but quickened her pace slightly, remembering Mike's advice about trusting her instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is, he had told the class repeatedly. Your subconscious picks up on danger signals before your conscious mind processes them. The young man began walking in the same direction, staying about 10 feet behind her. Sarah could hear his footsteps on the concrete, matching her rhythm. When she slowed down, he slowed down. When she sped up, he did the same. Her heart rate increased, and she began mentally reviewing the techniques Mike had taught them. Remember the basics, she could hear his voice in her head. Awareness first, avoidance second, action only when necessary. But, if action becomes necessary, commit completely. Half measures won't save you. Sarah reached into her purse and wrapped her fingers around her cell phone, ready to dial 911 if needed. The street ahead looked empty, with most of the houses showing only dim porch lights. She considered crossing to the other side but realized that might signal fear and potentially escalate the situation. "Ma'am," the voice came from much closer now. Sarah turned to see the young man had closed the distance between them significantly. Up close, she could see that his eyes appeared dilated, and his movements seemed slightly uncoordinated. "I was wondering if you could help me out." "I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry," Sarah replied firmly, continuing to walk. Mike had taught them never to stop moving if they felt threatened. "Keep your legs free, keep your options open," he always said. "Just take a minute," the young man said, now walking alongside her. "I'm really desperate here." Sarah noticed his right hand was concealed inside his hoodie pocket, and alarm bells went off in her mind. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood before her family moved to the suburbs, and her older brother had taught her to recognize the warning signs of someone carrying a weapon. "I can't help you," she said more forcefully, picking up her pace significantly. "Please leave me alone." The young man suddenly stepped directly in front of her, forcing her to stop. "Look, lady, I tried to be nice about this," he said, his demeanor changing completely. His previously polite tone disappeared, replaced by aggression. "I need what's in that purse, and I need it now." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Mike had drilled into them that the moment someone blocked your path and made demands, the situation had escalated beyond de-escalation. When talking fails, when escape isn't possible, you have to act, he had told them. "But, you act smart, not angry." "Okay," Sarah said, raising her hands in what appeared to be a surrender gesture while actually positioning herself for defense. "Don't hurt me. My purse is right here." She began to lower her purse slowly, watching his eyes follow the movement. Mike had taught them that most attackers fixate on what they want, creating opportunities for defenders who stay mentally focused on escape rather than compliance. The young man reached toward the purse with his left hand while keeping his right hand hidden. Sarah could now see the outline of something in his pocket, something that looked like the handle of a knife. "That's smart," he said, relaxing slightly as he thought he was getting what he wanted. "Just hand it over nice and slow, and nobody gets hurt." Sarah continued lowering the purse, but, instead of handing it to him, she let it drop to the ground. As his eyes automatically followed the falling bag, she executed the movement Mike had made them practice dozens of times, a sharp upward palm strike aimed at the attacker's nose, followed immediately by a knee strike to the groin. The palm strike connected solidly, snapping the young man's head back and causing his eyes to water immediately. Before he could recover, Sarah's knee found its target, doubling him over in pain. As he bent forward, she brought her knee up again, this time connecting with his face. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, just as Mike had promised it would if they committed fully to the movements. The young man stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose, completely disoriented by the sudden reversal of what he thought was a controlled situation. Sarah didn't wait to see if he would recover. She grabbed her purse and ran the remaining 2 blocks to her apartment building, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She had acted exactly as trained, using overwhelming force for a brief moment to create an opportunity for escape. Once safely inside her building, Sarah called 911 to report the attempted robbery. The dispatcher took her information and assured her that officers would patrol the area. Sarah also called Mike Chen to let him know that his training had worked exactly as he had promised it would. "You did everything right," Mike told her over the phone. "You stayed alert, you tried to avoid confrontation, and, when you had no choice but to act, you acted decisively. That's exactly what we've been practicing." But Sarah knew this was only the beginning of her story. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it would change how she thought about personal safety forever. More importantly, it would prepare her for an even more serious situation that was coming much sooner than anyone could have predicted. As she double-checked the locks on her apartment door that night, Sarah had no idea that the young man who had tried to rob her was part of a larger group that had been targeting women in the neighborhood for weeks. She also didn't know that her successful defense had been witnessed by someone who had very different plans for dealing with what he saw as a problem that needed to be solved. The real test of her training was still 3 days away, and it would involve much more than a desperate drug user looking for quick cash. It would involve someone who had taken her measure during that first encounter and decided she represented a threat that needed to be eliminated rather than avoided. Sarah fell asleep that night feeling proud of how she had handled herself, unaware that her troubles were just beginning. The next morning would bring new challenges that would ultimately lead to the moment when a training knife would change everything she thought she knew about defending herself. The phone call that would set everything in motion came at 7:30 the next morning, while Sarah was getting ready for work. It was her neighbor Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down and kept track of everything that happened in their building. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight with concern. "I think you should know that there was a man asking questions about you yesterday evening. He was asking the doorman which apartment you lived in and what time you usually came home." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had hoped that Tuesday night's encounter was over and done with, but apparently the situation was more complicated than she had realized. "Did you get a description of this man?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer would not be good news. "Well, that's the thing, dear. It wasn't the same young man from the police report. This was someone older, maybe in his 30s, and he seemed much more professional, if you know what I mean. He wasn't acting like some desperate kid. He was asking questions like someone who was planning something." Sarah thanked Mrs. Patterson and immediately called her supervisor to explain that she would be working from home for the rest of the week. She also called the police detective who had taken her report about Tuesday's incident, but he told her that asking questions wasn't illegal and there wasn't much they could do unless the man actually committed a crime. "Keep your doors locked, vary your routine if possible, and call us immediately if you see this person again," the detective advised. "But, legally, we can't do anything about someone asking questions." Sarah spent Wednesday and Thursday working from her apartment, ordering groceries online, and feeling increasingly frustrated by the situation. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was the one hiding inside while whoever was asking about her remained free to continue his investigation. On Friday morning, Mike Shin called with an unexpected proposal that would change everything. "Sarah, I've been thinking about your situation," he said. "I have a friend who works in private security, and he's developed some advanced training scenarios that go way beyond what we cover in our regular classes. Would you be interested in participating in what he calls reality-based preparation?" Sarah was intrigued. "What does that involve?" "Well, it's designed for people who have already demonstrated they can handle basic self-defense situations but need to prepare for more complex threats. It involves scenarios with multiple attackers, weapons training, and psychological preparation for extended confrontations." The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence, but Sarah's intuition told her to trust Mike's judgment. He had already proven that his training worked under real conditions. "When would this happen?" she asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're available. It's at a private training facility outside the city, and it's completely confidential. My friend Jake runs these sessions for law enforcement and military personnel who need advanced preparation, but he occasionally works with civilians who are facing specific threats." Sarah agreed to meet at the facility Saturday at 2 p.m., not realizing that the man who had been asking questions about her had been monitoring her phone calls and already knew about the planned training session. In fact, he was counting on it. The training facility sat on 15 acres of wooded property 30 minutes outside the city, accessible only by a winding gravel road that disappeared into dense pine trees. Sarah arrived at exactly 2 p.m. Saturday afternoon, parking her Honda Civic next to two pickup trucks and a black SUV in the small clearing that served as a parking area. Jake Morrison emerged from a converted warehouse building that looked like it had once been used for equipment storage. He was a compact man in his early 40s with graying hair and the precise movements of someone who had spent years in dangerous situations. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes held the kind of calm intensity that Sarah associated with people who had seen real combat. "Mike tells me you handled yourself well under pressure this week," Jake said, leading her toward the building. "That's good, because what we're going to work on today builds on those same instincts, but pushes them much further." Inside, the warehouse had been converted into a sophisticated training environment. There were different sections set up to simulate various scenarios: a mock apartment, a parking garage, an office building hallway, and an open area with mats for hand-to-hand combat practice. The lighting could be adjusted to simulate different times of day, and there were speakers positioned throughout that could create ambient noise to add realism to training scenarios. The difference between basic self-defense and reality-based preparation, Jake explained as they toured the facility, is that basic training assumes you'll face one attacker who wants something simple like money or your car. Reality-based training prepares you for attackers who have more complex motivations and better planning. Sarah noticed that there were several other people in the facility, but Jake explained that they were training assistants who helped create realistic scenarios. She felt comfortable with the professional atmosphere and the obvious investment in serious equipment and training methodologies. "We're going to start with weapons recognition and response," Jake said, leading her to a table covered with various items. Most people think of weapons as guns and knives, but attackers use whatever gives them an advantage. The table displayed an array of items: kitchen knives, box cutters, improvised weapons made from common objects, and several training weapons that looked completely realistic but were designed to be safe for practice scenarios. Jake picked up what appeared to be a combat knife with a black handle and serrated edge. "This is a training knife," he said, handing it to Sarah. "It's made from hard rubber and designed to look and feel exactly like the real thing, but it can't actually cut anyone. We use these for scenario training because they create the psychological pressure of facing a real weapon without the danger." Sarah examined the training knife carefully. It was remarkably realistic, with weight and balance that felt authentic. The psychological impact of holding what appeared to be a deadly weapon was immediate and unsettling, even knowing it was fake. "The key to dealing with weapons," Jake continued, "is understanding that the weapon isn't really the threat. The person holding it is the threat. The weapon is just a tool, and every tool has limitations and vulnerabilities that can be exploited if you understand them. They spent the first hour working through scenarios where Sarah learned to recognize different types of weapons and understand their effective ranges and limitations. Jake taught her that knives were actually less dangerous than most people believed if you understood how to control distance and timing, while improvised weapons like broken bottles or screwdrivers could be more unpredictable and harder to defend against. "Now we're going to put this knowledge to work," Jake said, leading her to the mock apartment section of the facility. "I want you to go through your normal evening routine while my assistants create a scenario around you. The key is to stay aware and react appropriately to whatever develops." Sarah entered what looked like a perfect replica of a typical apartment, complete with furniture, lighting, and normal household items. She began simulating her usual evening activities, checking mail, making dinner, watching television. For the first 10 minutes, nothing unusual happened, and she began to relax slightly. Then, she heard a sound from what would have been the bedroom area. It was subtle, just the faint creak of floorboards that might have been normal settling of the building, or might have been something else entirely. Sarah remembered Mike's teaching about trusting her instincts and decided to investigate rather than ignore the sound. As she moved toward the bedroom, she noticed that the lighting in the hallway seemed dimmer than it had been when she first entered the apartment. Her awareness heightened, and she began moving more carefully, staying close to walls and avoiding the center of the hallway where she would be most vulnerable. The bedroom appeared empty when she looked inside, but something felt wrong about the space. The closet door, which had been closed when she first toured the apartment, was now slightly ajar. Sarah's training told her not to approach the closet directly, but to find a position that would give her multiple escape routes if needed. She was backing toward the bedroom door when she heard Jake's voice from somewhere in the apartment. "Sarah, we have a problem out here. Can you come to the living room?" The request seemed reasonable, but something about the tone made Sarah hesitate. It was Jake's voice, but it sounded slightly different than it had during their earlier conversation, more urgent, less controlled. She decided to stay where she was and call out instead of moving. "What kind of problem?" she asked loudly. Instead of an answer, she heard footsteps moving quickly through the apartment, and they were definitely coming in her direction. Sarah positioned herself so that she could see the bedroom doorway while keeping the wall behind her for protection. A figure appeared in the doorway, but it wasn't Jake. It was a man she had never seen before, wearing dark clothing and moving with obvious hostile intent. In his right hand, he carried what appeared to be the same training knife Jake had shown her earlier. "This is a scenario," Sarah reminded herself, trying to stay calm. "This is training, not a real attack." But the psychological pressure was intense. Even knowing the knife was fake, facing an aggressive stranger in a confined space triggered every survival instinct she possessed. The man was blocking her primary escape route, and the bedroom window was too high and too small to be a viable option. "Just stay calm," the man said, advancing slowly into the room. "This will be over quickly if you don't fight." Sarah recognized this as part of the training scenario, but the realism was overwhelming. Her heart rate spiked exactly as it had during the real encounter earlier in the week, and her body began preparing for fight-or-flight response. The man continued advancing, holding the training knife in what she now recognized as a reverse grip blade pointing downward from his fist, which Jake had taught her was often used by people who had some knife-fighting experience rather than desperate amateurs. Sarah calculated her options quickly. She could try to rush past him toward the door, but that would put her directly in the path of his weapon. She could try to find something in the room to use as a defensive weapon, but that would take time and attention she couldn't spare. Or she could use what Jake had just taught her about weapons being tools with limitations. She chose option 3. Instead of backing away or trying to escape, Sarah suddenly stepped forward and to the side, moving inside the arc of the knife's effective range. The movement surprised the attacker, who had expected her to retreat and had positioned himself accordingly. As she moved inside his reach, Sarah grabbed his wrist with both hands, using her body weight and momentum to control the weapon rather than trying to overpower him directly. Jake had taught her that controlling the weapon was more important than defeating the attacker, especially when dealing with knives. The maneuver worked exactly as Jake had demonstrated. By controlling the attacker's wrist and staying inside his reach, Sarah made the knife essentially useless while putting herself in position to use her knees and elbows against targets on his body. But, instead of following through with strikes that would end the scenario, Sarah found herself hesitating. Something about the situation felt different from what she had expected from a training exercise. The man's breathing was ragged in a way that seemed more like real exertion than acting, and his attempts to break free from her grip felt genuinely desperate rather than controlled. Scenario complete, she called out loudly, expecting the exercise to end. Instead of stopping, the man intensified his efforts to break free, twisting violently and trying to pull his knife hand away from her control. Sarah realized with growing alarm that this might not be a training scenario after all. Jake's voice came from somewhere outside the room, but he sounded far away and his words were unclear. Sarah couldn't tell if he was giving instructions to end the scenario or if he was dealing with his own situation elsewhere in the facility. The man she was fighting began using his free hand to strike at her head and shoulders, hits that felt much harder than what she would expect from a controlled training exercise. Sarah made a decision that would prove to be crucial. She stopped treating the situation like practice and started treating it like a real fight for her life. Using the wrist control she had already established, Sarah drove her knee upward into the attacker's solar plexus with full force. The impact folded him over immediately, and she followed up with an elbow strike to the back of his head that sent him to the floor. As he fell, the training knife skittered across the floor, and Sarah could see that what she had assumed was hard rubber was actually metal that had been painted black. This was not a training weapon. This was a real knife that someone had disguised to look like the training equipment. Sarah backed toward the bedroom door, her mind racing to understand what was happening. Was this an extremely realistic training scenario, or had something gone seriously wrong? The professional environment and Jake's credentials had convinced her that this was legitimate training, but the evidence was mounting that she had been deceived. She made it to the bedroom doorway just as she heard what sounded like a struggle coming from the main area of the facility. Jake's voice, definitely Jake's voice this time, was shouting something about calling the police. Sarah had to make a choice: investigate what was happening to Jake, or focus on getting herself to safety. Her training told her that in an unclear situation, personal safety took priority over helping others, but her instincts told her that Jake might be in serious trouble. The decision was made for her when she heard footsteps running toward the bedroom from multiple directions. Whatever was happening, it involved more than just the one man she had fought in the bedroom. Sarah looked around desperately for another option and noticed that the bedroom had a second door that appeared to lead to a bathroom. If the bathroom had a window or another exit, it might provide a way out of the immediate area. She moved quickly toward the bathroom door, but before she could reach it, two more men appeared in the bedroom doorway. These weren't training assistants or actors playing roles. These were people who had come here with a specific plan that involved her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone had used her desire for advanced training as a way to get her isolated and vulnerable. The man who had been asking questions about her hadn't been planning to attack her at her apartment. He had been planning something much more sophisticated. Sarah understood now that the next few minutes would determine whether she survived to tell anyone what had happened. The training she had received from Mike and Jake was about to be tested under conditions neither of them had ever imagined, and the outcome would depend on her ability to think clearly while fighting for her life against multiple attackers in an unfamiliar environment. The bathroom door was still 10 feet away, and the two men were positioning themselves to cut off her escape routes. In her peripheral vision, she could see the first attacker getting back to his feet, blood streaming from his nose where her elbow had connected. 3 against 1, in a confined space, with no backup coming and no one expecting her to be missing until Monday morning. Sarah realized that everything she had learned about self-defense was about to be compressed into whatever happened in the next 60 seconds. Sarah's mind shifted into a state of clarity that surprised her even as she faced the most dangerous moment of her life. The two men advancing from the doorway moved with coordination that told her they had done this before, while the man behind her was still recovering from her earlier strikes but would soon rejoin the fight. The first attacker from the doorway carried a length of rope, confirming Sarah's worst fears about their intentions. The second man had what appeared to be a stun gun, the kind used for livestock that could incapacitate someone instantly. These weren't opportunistic criminals, they were organized and equipped for exactly what they were trying to do. Time seemed to slow as Sarah evaluated her impossible situation. The bathroom door remained her best option for escape, but reaching it meant getting past or through at least one of the attackers. Fighting 3 men simultaneously was not something any amount of training could guarantee success against, but surrender was not an option given what they clearly had planned. Jake's voice echoed from somewhere in the facility, shouting instructions that Sarah couldn't make out clearly, but that sounded like he was directing someone to call for backup. Whether that was real or another deception didn't matter now. Sarah was on her own and had to act immediately. She feinted toward the window as if planning to try breaking through it, drawing both attackers in that direction. The moment they shifted their positions to cut off that route, Sarah spun and sprinted directly toward the man with the rope, choosing to face him rather than the one with the electrical weapon. Her sudden charge caught him off guard, and Sarah managed to get inside his reach before he could bring the rope into play. She drove her shoulder into his midsection while simultaneously grabbing for his weapon, using her momentum to drive him backward into his partner. The collision sent both attackers stumbling, and Sarah found herself holding one end of the rope while the first man still gripped the other end. Instead of trying to pull it away from him, Sarah reversed direction and used the rope like a leash, yanking him off balance and toward the hard edge of a wooden dresser that was part of the room's furnishing. The impact of his shoulder against the dresser corner made a sound that Sarah knew meant serious injury, but she didn't have time to assess the damage. The man with the stun gun was recovering his position, and the original bedroom attacker was moving to block her path to the bathroom door. Sarah released the rope and grabbed a heavy ceramic lamp from the dresser, swinging it in a wide arc that forced both remaining attackers to back up. The lamp shattered against the wall, leaving her holding a jagged ceramic base that made an improvised weapon more psychologically intimidating than practically useful. "Stay back," she shouted, hoping her voice would carry to wherever Jake was and alert him to her specific location. "I know how to use this." The bluff worked for about 3 seconds, until the man with the stun gun realized that a broken lamp was not actually much of a threat against an electrical weapon. He began advancing again, holding the device in front of him like a pistol. Sarah's training had never covered stun guns specifically, but the principle was the same as with any weapon: avoid the dangerous end and control the person wielding it. She hurled the ceramic base directly at his face, not expecting to cause serious damage but hoping to disrupt his concentration long enough to close distance. The improvised projectile struck him in the forehead, causing him to flinch and raise his hands defensively. Sarah used that moment to rush forward, but instead of trying to grab his weapon hand, she tackled him low around the waist, driving both of them to the floor. The stun gun discharged as they fell, but the electrical arc passed harmlessly over Sarah's head. She found herself on top of her attacker and immediately began striking his face and throat with rapid elbow strikes, using her superior position to deliver maximum damage in minimum time. Behind her, she could hear the third attacker approaching, but she was committed now to finishing the immediate threat before dealing with the next one. 3 more elbow strikes rendered the man beneath her unconscious, and Sarah rolled away just as she felt hands grabbing for her shoulders. The original bedroom attacker had recovered enough to rejoin the fight, but his movements were still unsteady from the head trauma she had inflicted earlier. Sarah scrambled to her feet and found herself facing him one-on-one, with 2 of his partners down and possibly out of the fight permanently. The man was holding the real knife again, having retrieved it while she fought the others. His face was a mask of blood and rage, and Sarah could see that he was beyond rational thought now. This had become personal for him in a way that made him even more dangerous but also more predictable. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he snarled, advancing with the knife held low in an attack position. This was supposed to be simple. Sarah backed toward the bathroom door, keeping her hands up in a defensive posture while calculating distance and timing. The man was injured and angry, which meant he would likely attack aggressively rather than patiently. That gave her an opportunity if she could time her response correctly. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious even in her desperate circumstances. "What did I do to deserve this?" "You hurt my brother," he said, confirming what Sarah had suspected. This was connected to the attempted robbery earlier in the week. "You put him in the hospital with a broken nose and a concussion. Nobody does that to family." The answer told Sarah everything she needed to know about her attacker's mindset. This wasn't about money or even revenge in a calculated sense. This was emotional, which meant he would make mistakes if she could provoke the right response. Your brother tried to rob me, she said, continuing to back toward the bathroom while keeping eye contact. I defended myself. That's not my fault. Shut up, he screamed, lunging forward with the knife aimed at her chest. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment, the emotional explosion that would make him commit to an attack before thinking it through. As he charged forward, she stepped to the side and caught his wrist again, but this time she was ready for his momentum and used it against him. Instead of trying to stop his forward motion, Sarah redirected it, guiding him past her and directly into the bathroom door frame. His head struck the wooden frame with tremendous force, and the knife fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The impact was so severe that Sarah knew immediately this fight was over. The man collapsed to the floor, unconscious and possibly worse. She grabbed the knife and checked quickly on the other two attackers, confirming that neither was in condition to continue fighting. The facility had become eerily quiet, and Sarah realized she could no longer hear Jake's voice. Either he had resolved whatever situation he was dealing with, or something had happened to him that prevented him from continuing to call for help. Sarah made her way carefully toward the main area of the facility, holding the knife ready but hoping she wouldn't need to use it. What she found there explained everything that had happened and confirmed her worst fears about how she had been manipulated. Jake was tied to a chair in the center of the room, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead but very much alive. Standing beside him was a man Sarah had never seen before but whose presence explained how the attackers had known about the training session. The famous Sarah Martinez, the man said calmly. I have to admit, you've exceeded even my expectations. 3 against 1 in an unfamiliar environment, and you not only survived but won decisively. Sarah kept the knife pointed toward him while scanning the room for additional threats. Who are you? I'm someone who was hired to solve a problem, he said. Your little display of self-defense skills earlier this week embarrassed the wrong people. My client wanted you to understand that actions have consequences. Your client being the brother of the kid who tried to rob me? Among others. But that's not really important now. What's important is that you've demonstrated capabilities that could be useful in the right circumstances. Sarah realized with growing horror that this had never been about revenge. It had been a test, an evaluation of her abilities under extreme pressure. The elaborate setup, the realistic training environment, even Jake's involvement had all been designed to see how she would perform when facing genuinely life-threatening violence. You're recruiting, she said, the pieces falling into place. This whole thing was a job interview. The man smiled. A very thorough job interview. And you've passed with remarkable success. Sarah looked at Jake, who was shaking his head slightly, trying to communicate something without speaking. She realized he had been a genuine victim in this situation, probably contacted by these people claiming to need his facility for some legitimate purpose. What makes you think I would be interested in whatever you're offering? Sarah asked, buying time to think through her options. Because you've just proven that you have natural talent for violence and the psychological makeup to use it effectively when necessary. Those are rare and valuable qualities. Sarah understood now that she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could use the knife she held to try to fight her way out of this situation, probably getting herself and Jake killed in the process. She could pretend to be interested in whatever this man was offering, hoping to find a better opportunity to escape later. Or she could try something that would end this situation immediately but require her to cross a line she had never imagined crossing. You're right, she said, lowering the knife slightly. I am interested. But I need to know more about what you're offering. The man relaxed visibly, interpreting her response as surrender to his proposal. That relaxation was exactly what Sarah had been hoping to provoke. Excellent. Let me explain how this organization works and what your role would be. As he began to speak, moving closer to her in his enthusiasm to describe his offer, Sarah struck with the same decisive commitment she had used against all the other attackers. The knife moved in one smooth motion, finding its target before he could react. But, instead of going for a killing blow, Sarah used the blade to cut the rope binding Jake to the chair, freeing him while simultaneously positioning herself between him and their captor. Run, she told Jake quietly. Get to your truck and drive until you can call the police. Jake didn't hesitate, moving quickly toward the exit while the man who had orchestrated everything stared at Sarah in shock, unable to process how quickly the situation had reversed. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said, reaching inside his jacket for what was obviously a weapon. "No," Sarah replied, settling into the fighting stance Mike had taught her so many weeks ago. "You made the mistake when you assumed I was someone who could be bought or intimidated." The final confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, guided by Jake's frantic radio calls from his truck, they found Sarah sitting calmly beside a man who would require extensive surgery to repair the damage from what the official report would describe as defensive wounds sustained during attempted kidnapping. 3 other men were found unconscious in the mock bedroom, 2 of whom would face permanent disabilities from their injuries. The investigation that followed would uncover a network of criminal recruitment that had been operating for years, using elaborate scenarios to identify and recruit people with specific psychological profiles for various illegal activities. Sarah never learned the exact identity of the client who had ordered her evaluation, but the investigation revealed connections to several organized crime families who had been seeking to expand their operations using people with no criminal backgrounds who could pass background checks and psychological evaluations. The training knife that had started everything was never found. Sarah had thrown it into the woods during her walk back to civilization, wanting no reminders of the day when she discovered that her capacity for violence was far greater than she had ever imagined. 6 months later, Sarah moved to a different city and took a job with a security consulting firm that specialized in teaching personal protection to corporate executives. She never again felt the need to take a self-defense class, but she sometimes wondered what would have happened if she had made different choices during those crucial moments in the mock bedroom. Mike Chen continued teaching his community center classes, but he added a new element to his curriculum: extensive discussion of how to verify the credentials and intentions of anyone offering advanced training opportunities. He also kept in touch with Sarah, partly out of professional interest in how his basic training had scaled up under extreme conditions, but mostly because he recognized that she had been changed fundamentally by her experience. The young man whose attempted robbery had started the entire chain of events spent 6 weeks in the hospital and was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison. His brother, who had coordinated the elaborate revenge scheme, was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and assault. But the impact on Sarah went beyond the legal resolutions and official reports. She had discovered that under sufficient pressure, she was capable of making life-and-death decisions with a clarity and commitment that she had never known she possessed. That knowledge changed how she moved through the world, not because she was looking for trouble, but because she now understood exactly what she could do if trouble found her. The real lesson of the training knife incident wasn't about fighting techniques or weapons defense. It was about the discovery that ordinary people, when pushed beyond their normal limits, could access reserves of determination and capability that they had never imagined. Sarah had gone into that facility thinking she needed to learn how to be stronger and more prepared. She had emerged knowing that she had always been stronger than she realized. She had just never been in a situation that required her to find out.